women need three things. I have a slide that women need three things, according to the research, to have the best orgasm. And the two things are that you're in a securely attached relationship and that you have the right context, that you feel safe, which is kind of these flowers, these roses, it's romantic. But the third thing is that it's highly erotic. That's the third thing. So it's true that some women really get turned on by flowers and candlelight, but some women don't. That doesn't fit their highly erotic box.
Welcome to yourbrilliance.com. I'm your host, Amy Waterman. If you've ever worried about when to sleep with someone, or whether your naked body was good enough, or whether you're wild enough in bed to fulfill his sexual fantasies, then you are going to love today's interview. We're going to be talking about the neuroscience of desire, new findings in women's sexual health that can help you reclaim your voice and your pleasure. We're going to be talking to Heidi Crockett, the author of The Neuroscience of Dating. Heidi is a licensed psychotherapist and professional speaker in relational neuroscience. She's certified in sex therapy and sexuality education with postgraduate training in sexual health from the University of Michigan. Currently, she works in her own private practice and teaches at the True North Health Center. Welcome, Heidi.
Thank you. Happy to be here, Amy.
So I want to start out, when we were talking earlier, you had mentioned a movie that very much inspired you, Ask Dr. Ruth. And Dr. Ruth is one of those pioneers in sexuality education, especially for women. What makes her such an inspiration?
Yeah, Ask Dr. Ruth. It just came out. It's available in theaters for a month, and then it goes on to Hulu next month. She is an inspiration as a sex therapist. You know, she was orphaned during World War II, and then she just went on and did a lot of research in women's sexual health. And even during when AIDS broke out in the 80s, she was a real advocate for gays and basically treating all people with respect. So I feel like as a sex educator, that was my favorite thing about her, and also her resiliency, her life, how she survived and thrived, and she is still speaking and writing books, and she's like 90 years old. So yeah, Dr. Ruth is an inspiration.
Well, and what I really think about when you think about somebody who's 90, you think about the change they have seen in their lifetime. Because if we think about, even 50 years ago, we didn't know half of what we know about women's pleasure and women's sexual health. What have we learned since Dr. Ruth started practicing?
Yeah.
What have we learned about women's sexual health?
That is a great question. We have learned so much. When I give my lectures, like I have a lecture on Saturday called New Findings in Sexual Health. At the beginning of the talk, I have people crumple up a piece of paper. I throw it in the corner of the room, and I was like, whatever you think about women's sexual health, you need to just throw it out, because basically it's probably like men's sexual health light, and it's not what the research says. So there's a lot of
interesting.
There's a lot of new information.
What we have learned about women's sexual health came from studying men.
Yes. Yeah. So here's one example: responsive desire versus spontaneous desire. So 70% of men have what's called spontaneous desire. That means they look at something, they immediately experience desire. Whereas women don't do that. 30% of women have that responsive desire. So you just got to kind of stoke the flame. And it's a different, so a lot of women, they actually got rid of DSM, the low desire disorder, because there's no such thing as, this is confusing for people who aren't sex therapists. There's a difference between arousal and desire. We don't really have to get into it, but they threw out the desire card for women, because most women, their sexuality is such that they're more likely to have responsive desire, not spontaneous desire. So what women need to do in their sexuality is, the first thing is they need to not compare themselves to men or to what they've been taught about sex. Because like I said, there's all this new research that's come out about women's sexuality, that once I start giving people this information, couples and women, and they have the information and they apply it totally destigmatizes them, feeling like there's something wrong with them, and they're able to, achieve orgasms better and whatnot. So I'll keep describing the different things besides the responsive and the
Well, I
spontaneous.
just want to quickly talk about that because I think this is really important, like to have thrown out the fact that low desire is a problem in women, because we've been told, right? We've been told that there is something wrong if we're not always up for it, because he's always up for it. So why aren't we always up for it? Does it mean we don't love
Right.
him enough? So this is pretty amazing, because what it means is for desire to happen, we have to have something to respond to, right?
Right.
This is maybe sexy texts or planning, sex at night. We need to be able to look forward to it rather than he's coming off, giving us hugs, starting kissing, and, oh, right, now we're supposed to feel
Right.
hot.
He's in spontaneous desire and we need responsive desire. That's right. And the other big buzzword is called context. So that is kind of your internal thoughts and your external environment. And that's huge for a woman, huge. So like if there's a clicking fan or if you need the door to be locked or whatever it is, some women, they'll say, oh, I just need to XYZ. But what the research is showing is that in order for a woman's like limbic brain to calm down and for her, there's this thing called the sexual accelerator and the sexual brake. In order for her to take her foot off the sexual brake and for her desire to begin and put her foot on the sexual accelerator, her limbic brain needs to calm down and the context has to be right.
So this is why all those trappings of romance, candlelight, a nice dinner, an evening away from the kids, they actually do matter.
They do. And also, I also always like to bust the myth that women need three things. I have a slide that women need three things, according to the research, to have the best orgasm. And the two things are that you're in a securely attached relationship and that you have the right context, that you feel safe, which is kind of these flowers, these roses, it's romantic. But the third thing is that it's highly erotic. That's the third thing. So it's true that some women really get turned on by flowers and candlelight, but some women don't. That doesn't fit their highly erotic box. Just to not all women are that way.
No, that's fantastic. So one of the problems, though, is that when we talk about, the spontaneous, I think that's so important. The fact that we're supposed to be automatically hot all the time. And if we're not hot, men aren't going to want to be with us. This actually, culturally, this dates back to the Roaring 20s where, up all throughout history, women didn't have to be sexy to have a healthy marriage. We had sex to have babies, but then the 20s hit. And suddenly sexual satisfaction, if you weren't having it in a marriage, it was a reason to leave. And so we've got all this pressure. We can't gain weight because we might wreck our bodies and then he wouldn't want to have sex with us. We can't, we have to be really good in bed. We've got to know all these techniques. We've got to be up for it as much as he is. And if we aren't, he has the right to judge us and leave us. What's that doing?
Well, interestingly enough, it's doing a lot and society is affecting us. And those points are very important that you bring up. But what the research shows is, like, for example, the number one way that a woman can improve her orgasms right now is by what she thinks about her body and her attitudes towards sex. So it's interesting as you're describing all those things, it's the things that we say to ourselves in our head and then repeat over and over, especially at the beginning of it, when we're starting to feel sexual or be sexual with our partner, that inhibits our arousal and stops us from really enjoying sex.
Oh my goodness. So it's actually those thoughts more than his judgment.
But they feed on each other. So, that's why it's interesting. In my Neuroscience of Dating book, I talk the definition of integration, which is like health, and it's differentiation and linkage, which, if you can think about that, it's just turning towards the person and having space. And good mental health is the right amount of space, the right amount of turning towards and the right amount of space. And you can apply that in the bedroom. And it's the same thing with our thoughts or with other people. So when you say what you're talking about, I just want to validify that if someone is with a partner who's saying a lot of critical things about them, that in and of itself is a bad thing and a person should stay away from that. But it is really the things that women say in their heads that really affect their ability to enjoy sex, according to the sex research.
So I'm going to ask the $1 million question. How do we stop saying those things to ourselves in our heads?
So the first thing you don't do is you don't criticize yourself for criticizing yourself, right? So then you've got your foot on the sexual brake, and then you're just putting more brakes on. What you want to do is if you think of your sexuality as a garden, and those bad contexts, those bad thoughts are like weeds, and you want to plant a new thought. So I'm okay. My body is good enough. I'm pretty. So when you notice yourself saying something negative to yourself in your head, just think of it as a weed that crept in, and just plant a new plant there, which is something positive that's believable to you.
Wow. So I actually want to talk about something that I learned about recently, autoeroticism, the ability to be turned on by ourselves. There is a fabulous, I have no idea where it came from, this study where they asked women, would you have sex with yourself? And a lot of women said, hell yeah. They asked men, would you have sex with yourself? And not very many men said, hell yeah. So this idea that we think we're turned on by our partner, but actually one of the really reliable ways we can get turned on is really thinking that we're pretty darn hot.
Yes, and that's that differentiation and linkage, that kind of space and linkage. If women can get a little bit of space from being very other focused, which is some tendency and some norms in society, and they can look inside themselves, there's also a tendency in society for us to make a little space between us and our erotic feelings. And if we can counter that and actually turn towards and get closer to that and develop our relationship with our erotic thoughts, I absolutely think it's very important. When I work with couples, I'll make sure each individual is able to find sexual pleasure on their own, and then you can find it together as a couple. And I think both are equally important. So what you're talking about, I 100% agree. I think women should spend more time figuring out what it is on that number 3 on that list of 1, 2, 3 of what it is that's highly erotic for them, and to be aware of that at least once every single day.
Oh, that's fantastic. So I want to talk about then kind of pulling back to more of a cultural level. When we're thinking about sleeping with somebody for the first time, that's when those thoughts often hit, because it's one thing to sleep with a partner who knows us, there's no surprises, but to get naked in front of somebody we've never got naked before, we don't necessarily know what he likes, we don't know whether we're going to enjoy it, we're also becoming quite vulnerable. How can we make that decision to sleep with somebody for the first time in a really empowered, strong way?
Yeah, so how can we make it in a strong way? I have 2 protective principles in my Neuroscience of Dating book. One is don't make yourself financially vulnerable, and the second is don't make yourself sexually vulnerable. And so we're really talking about number 2. So I would say, in terms of that context, people need to have an idea in their head ahead of time. Think about thinking, which is your higher brain function, of what would make them sexually vulnerable. What about that sexual moment is just right, that Goldilocks just right, and what is too far? So I think part of it is that we don't think ahead of time, and we're not really sure about our desire, and if the guy is good looking enough or the situation is just right enough, we might decide we want to have sex, but we're not really sure. And then what happens when we get really turned on is that part of our brain that thinks about thinking, it totally goes offline. So again, you really want to think about these things ahead of time. So making sure that you're doing it for the right reasons, I would say, and that is a very personal thing. But bad reasons would be like if you're lonely, or if you want to be wanted. And sometimes, again, when we're talking about the voices in our head, that can come from a very long time ago. And we just want to make sure that we're making just what you were talking about at the beginning of this call. We want to make those choices from a really empowered, secure place inside ourselves, not out of fear, which is more in the limbic brain. So to kind of summarize my advice, I would say there's kind of 2 different ways we can come from. We can come from the more primitive brain, which is fear, or we can think about thinking, we can use the prefrontal cortex, and we can come from curiosity. So I would say treat the moment with curiosity and have done some thinking about thinking, and know what's right for you ahead of time, and what you're okay to do and what you're not okay to do in that context of starting to be sexual with someone. Like, what level of sexual activity is okay with you? Because there are a lot of sexual activities that people can do that are totally safe, like showering together, or mutual masturbation with gloves, or kissing or hugging, or giving each other an erotic massage. And so a lot of people, what happens is we're not very creative. There's that curiosity with our sexuality, and we go straight to that sort of penis and vagina sex, that model. And what we want to do is we just want to be curious and creative. And then if you are going to go straight towards that, if you're just a very linear thinker and you're thinking, oh, if we're going to be sexual, you want to have phrases memorized in your head. So it can be like, your condoms or mine, or I bought this sampler pack, which one do you want to try? So again, you have things memorized ahead of time, because usually people are really nervous and anxious at the moment. So if you practice it, then you'll be ready.
Well, it makes a lot of sense to me, because one of the things about desire is when you surrender to the moment to really enjoy it, you got to turn off your brain. But if you turn off your brain, you can't necessarily think and make good decisions. So if you've got it all thought out beforehand, this is what I'm willing to do. These are my boundaries. This is what I'm going to say. Now, when I'm in the moment with him, I don't have to think about it. I can just surrender to the moment, knowing that I've got it figured out exactly how far I want to go, and I'm not going to go any further.
Yeah, you just summarized exactly my advice. Yep.
Yeah, it's so important. It's so important because, oh man, one of the things that really concerns me, I know about when I look at my own sexual history, is how many times I got into a situation where maybe I went further than I wanted to, but I wanted him to like me. I didn't want to say no and risk terminating what was, a very, perhaps, something that could have turned into a relationship. And so that puts us into fear. And what I find fascinating about what you're saying is, when you are worried about what he thinks about you, when you are worried that if you say no to what he wants, he won't like you anymore, that's actually making your sexual desire shut down, and it's making the experience less pleasurable.
It is. And it's interesting, all these different brain functions, they're all serving important purposes. So, not to downplay any of them, but it is true that once we're clear in our mind, once we're integrated about what we do and we don't want, and also what we desire and how we can get it, then it's easier in the moment to relax and just be with this person for what it is and what it isn't.
Oh, so I want to talk about, then, you have a book, The Neuroscience of Dating. Talk to us about that.
So this is the book. There'll be a link to it at the bottom. And then what we were talking about, I wanted to show a chart when we were talking about the limbic brain and the prefrontal cortex. I'm talking about this all the time. I also talk about the sexual accelerator, which is over here, the prefrontal cortex, and then the sexual brakes, which I think of as like the limbic brain. And my book is all about how these different and competing functions of the nervous system, what you can do consciously to integrate them. It's called bilateral hemispheric integration, vertical integration, memory integration. There's all different types of integration that we can do. And when you're dating, there's things you can do to screen your partner for their level of integration. So I've had people buy the book just because they're interested in increasing their emotional intelligence, not if they're interested in dating, because it explains the principles of what's called interpersonal neurobiology, which is, they've got over 50 different textbooks in it. It's a pretty popular field of science. And I'm sure there's some IPNB nerds out there, but maybe no one in your listening group who's heard of it. It's just such a fascinating field of science. I'm in love with it. And I took it, it's a little bit complicated, and I made it very simple in the book for people.
And you've actually got a sexual education site as well, don't you?
I do, yeah. I have two websites. One is my health and wellness blog. It's called Green Light Heidi. And then I later made Red Light Heidi. And it's basically a lot of my resources from the University of Michigan. I uploaded things on that redlightheidi.com website. There's a safe risk spectrum on it. It doesn't have a lot of information on it, but whenever I find a good resource, I put it on there.
Fantastic. And for those of you watching, if you want to find out more about Heidi's work and get the links to her book and her various websites, we have a link for you. Just go to yourbrilliance.org/Heidi. That's yourbrilliance.org/HEIDI. Thank you, Heidi, for coming onto the show. We are coming to the end, and I wondered if you had any last message you'd like to leave our viewers with.
Yeah, I wanted to mention a free meditation that I just did yesterday for people if you're having something that's emotionally charged. Maybe you're thinking about a first date that you're going on tonight. We'll create a link to a video I just created on YouTube for this technique called the Tapas acupressure technique. You can do it in about 5 minutes. So I did a guided meditation of that video. So for the listeners, you can have that, and it works to calm down if you're anxious or if you're having physical pain. I find the exercise works. So maybe I would just mention that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you much. And thank you out there for watching. We hope to see you again soon. Until then, let your brilliance shine.